everybody, welcome back to Kiss and Tell Magazine. This is a wonderful podcast time, and I'm Dr. Jenny. With me today is Dr. Lisa Speidel. I think I said it right. If not, correct me, please. And Lisa is here with us today to talk about her new book. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're looking forward to hearing about your book because from what I know, well, share your title with us about your book.
So my new book that just came out March 31st, 2025 is Bisexuality Beyond Binaries, Celebrating Multiple Bisexual Identities in a World of Erasure.
Yes,
Lots going on.
yeah, definitely. That's a mouthful. But based on what I know, I agree with why you wrote the book. I mean, because to me, bisexuality, and correct me if I'm wrong because this is your area, bisexuality seems to be not as discussed as far as all the sexualities, the LGBTQIA, well,
Yeah.
somewhere along the line, the B got smaller. I don't know.
So yeah, the B kind of got lost, but it is in that acronym. So still an important part of queer identities. But yeah, that is a big part of what the book is about. Bisexual people are called the invisible majority because it is estimated over 52% of people who are LGBTQ are bisexual. Um, but there is a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of stereotypes, myths, misinformation around bisexuality. So bisexual folks can face erasure in both queer and straight spaces. So a big part of writing the book was, kind of a combination of things. My editor at the time was looking for a book on bisexuality, and my a lot of my students were writing about being bisexual, and I was like, wow, this is interesting. This is a lot of folks writing about being bisexual, and also exploring my own bisexuality. Sort of those three things were the main factors of writing this book, and then it just exploded into so much learning and connecting and networking with all of these different folks across the country and the person in Israel too, so the world. So really amazing process. But the premise really is there's a lot of erasure for bisexual people, but also we're not talking about the intersection of other marginalized identities of folks who are bisexual. So bisexual people of color, bisexual trans people, um, sex workers, older people. There's a chapter on people who are older and aging. So just the missing voices of the missing voice. It's kind of the a double layered piece.
So your book is talking about as many aspects of it as it can.
Yes.
Okay.
And there's still even more, but it had to get into a book format. I think it's still longer than it was supposed to be, but
Yeah. You
uh,
want to make sure people could carry it.
yes, yes. And really thinking about like, what are those voices that are missing and kind of what's the history of misunderstanding and why is it so under researched? And then, again, when you have those intersections of those other identities, they're even less researched. Or oftentimes the B is just sort of combined with lesbian and gay in research. And so again, there's sort of this invisibility and kind of erasure that happens even in spaces that are supposed to be researching and not taking into account, what are some of the unique parts of that identity.
share with the audience the difference between, at least in my experience, people confuse queer with bisexuality.
Well, I think that queer is an umbrella term for, both gender identity and sexual orientation, that it just sort of enables folks to have sort of a collective identity that, um, to not have to explain all the different parts of identities that are counter to dominant culture norms. So people who are bisexual can use queer as an identity, part of that, sort of umbrella use of that umbrella term. There is some there are some folks who feel like it can erase their identity using an umbrella term, if they're not saying specifically bisexual. But then sometimes it's easier not to have to explain yourself because there's so much bias around bisexuality. I mean, and all the different sexual orientations and romantic orientations. I mean, really, these have been around for centuries. It's just that we really are uh, more concise with language and understanding and seeing that there can be differences. And that language is evolving. I think definitions for bisexuality have really evolved. I mean, originally the language was attraction to both sexes, or attraction to men and women, and that was very limiting as far as what about all the other gender identities that might exist. So that's part of the Bisexuality Beyond Binaries part of the title. Um, and that the definition has evolved into attraction to more than one gender. There was a definition for a while that was attraction to your own gender, and then another gender, and then it expanded to attraction to more than one gender. And now I think one of the ones that I like the best, but I really leave it up to folks what works best for them. I mean, that's part of the book too, is that, there isn't one way to define, it's really up to you. But that Robin Oakes, who is a bisexual activist and author, talks about the potential to have attraction, whether that's emotional, sexual, or romantic attraction to more than one gender, sex, or gender identity, um, not simultaneously, and not all at the same degree. Like it's just allowing for sort of this flexibility. But I love that idea of the potential to have that attraction. Because a lot of times people question bisexuality and say, aren't you just confused? Don't you just need to make a decision? Aren't you just being greedy? And how do you know if you're bisexual if you haven't had sex with, whatever, fill in the blank, right?
Right.
I always say in class, as a professor at university, when I teach human sexualities, I'm always like, I mean, when you were in fifth grade and had a crush on somebody, had you had sex with them yet? Probably not. And you already were deciding what your attraction was, or you were exploring that attraction. So you don't have to have sex with the person to have that identity. It's the potential for that attraction. And I really appreciate that definition because it's so inclusive and it really celebrates the fluidity of sexuality for a lot of folks. And that attraction is so amazing to me because, you might be like, oh, I absolutely would not be attracted to somebody who's my same gender identity. And then you meet someone and you're like, okay, then maybe I am. Like, or if that person's attracted to you and then you're like, oh, wow, that's really changing my attraction. Like it works in so many different ways. Obviously, don't get me started because I'll just keep going.
Well, I understand what you mean, but I think what confuses um, uh, people who are in the field, let's say, is the definition is broad and it's easy for it to be misinterpreted.
Right.
So I think that's why people get confused because you're right. They think, well, I'm bisexual. That means I would be sleeping with one or both, or all of them, all day above, so to speak. They
Yeah.
said, you just said you don't have to actually be intimate with the person physically to be considered bisexual. Correct.
Yeah. Attraction looks like a lot of different things.
Right.
But I think there's, in a society, um, Sherry Eisner is an author that talks about monosexism and the idea that we privilege people who are monosexual, which are people who are attracted to just one gender. And
Mhm.
we say that's what's normal, right? You're supposed to only be attracted to one gender, whether you're gay or straight, right? That it should just be one. And that we other folks that are attracted to more than one gender identity. Um, and that's part of the biphobia and bi erasure that exist is monosexism as sort of a form of systemic oppression. And I think um, I'm so fascinated by that because it just makes so much sense to me that you could potentially be attracted to more than one gender, but that's also my lived experience. But there's a lot of power in socialization and how what we say is supposed to be, right? Like compulsory sexuality, that we're all supposed to be sexual the same way, compulsory
Right.
monogamy, that we're all supposed to be monogamous, right?
Right.
So there is a lot of pressure to fit into those categories, which leaves people vulnerable to being questioned and not taken seriously. And, you're just confused, make a decision, it's just a phase, and being totally dismissed. And I don't really get that. Like, I'm like, well, if that's how, if that works for you, that's cool. Like, and, and again, there's so many people who actually are bisexual. If again, like I said, we don't talk about it. So they're considered the invisible majority. And that's a pretty large percentage of folks, but there's so much stigma that they often, are worried about not being taken seriously or, facing bias. And so we don't get to hear from them as much.
Or they don't understand it. I mean, or they don't define it in that way.
Yeah.
You're allowing, your book is allowing, and hopefully when the audience reads it, they can explore the open possibilities of defining sexuality. It's not, tunnel vision, so to speak.
Yeah.
Uh, but you're right, a lot of people think to be bisexual is to be sexually active with all possible genders. So,
Well, there's
but
also the stereotype then that you're actually hypersexual and and then you are a cheater, you're greedy, you can't commit, like I was just sort of shocked at like how many negative
yeah,
like stereotypes actually exist, and that a lot of people, again, like I've already said, whether queer identifying or straight, buy into these, and it's like, oh, that's just a stepping stone to coming out as gay, make your decision already, kind of thing, versus like, no, this is just who I am.
mhm,
And then there's the issue of like how are you seen while you're involved with someone? So, you're a woman involved with a man, so you look like a straight couple. You're a woman involved with a woman, so at that point you look gay, right? And so we try to decipher people's identities based on what kind of relationship they're in all the time. And again, that's another space that sort of erases that bisexuality, because it's like, no, you're involved with a woman, you're a woman, you're clearly gay. Like, that can't exist, right? As if bisexuality can't exist. We allow it a little bit more for two women. Now, for two men, it's like a guy does one sexual thing with another guy and he just instantly labeled gay, right? There's no flexibility.
right, right,
So we really don't hear about bisexual men. That's definitely underheard voice.
mhm,
Because it goes straight to like that binary of straight or gay.
mhm.
Again, how do we move sort of beyond that binary also? There's lots of binaries to challenge.
Yeah, there is because, well, the LGBTQIA, there's a lot going on there, and we don't have every little thing in that acronym. So, that's challenging too,
Yeah.
because if you don't fit in the LGBTQIA, how many times can I say it? Because then you're confused even more because you're like, wait a minute, I'm not any of that, but I do feel something. I am attracted to, whatever it may be, but
Well, there's other, I do write about this some also, that there are within sort of bisexual activism, the term bi plus has evolved to include folks who are pansexual or omnisexual or polysexual, which have some slight differences
right,
in their meaning, and but it still means like sort of multi-spectrum attraction, right? It's beyond just sort of male, female, both sexes, language. And um, that's part of the conversation too, because not all the letters can be included. That's often where the plus exists, and there's a lot of crossover between those identities, but it's just sort of allowing for um, you know, what's up for the individual? Like, well, how do they feel about themselves? What works for them and what creates community with a language that makes sense. There are plenty of folks who want to label other people. We should just respect the individual to decide for themselves, what works best for them
right,
and what that means, but it's hard. There's a couple pieces, where there's criticism of bisexuality sort of being transphobic and perpetuating transphobia because of this idea of attraction to both sexes and that it perpetuates the, two sexes, two gender binary. And that's where that language really changed because there are trans people who are bisexual, right? There are gender diverse people, non-binary people who are bisexual, and that attraction of more than one gender, people are like it that's way more inclusive and way more realistic about, what this means. The bi piece, to still have bi usually means two. And in that definition, it could be two or more. So there's some bi plus, right?
right,
And lots of variation for folks. And I would push back on it being transphobic. I would argue that the trans community and bi community have a lot in common and could be a really united front if there were conversations actually to be had because of so commonalities can be like, oh, trans identities aren't a real, it's not a real identity. Bisexuality is not considered a real identity. So, erasure is common. All the misinformation and misunderstanding and dismissiveness, there are obviously very different histories and very different lived experiences, but there are some commonalities. And again, referencing Sherry Eisner, she talks a lot about what would be so powerful if those communities were able to work together and recognize that there are bisexual people who are trans or and trans people who are bisexual. Um, so
right.
you've got that challenge and sort of breaking down that stereotype. There was another stereotype. Oh, there's the idea of like, I don't know if you've heard this before, but I talk a little bit about this, but this idea of like a gold star lesbian, is someone who's never had penetrative sex with a penis. And that, bisexual, say for example, bisexual women are considered kind of damaged goods because if they have been sexual with a man also or with a penis also, and that sort of bias and how divisive is that within community that it's like, oh, we have this hierarchy of like being as sexual beings and like what's going on with that, like why why do we care so much? And there are a lot of people who don't have the privilege, I don't know if privilege is the right word, but don't have the lived experience of not having a heterosexual interaction at some point, even if they are queer, even if they are gay, but feeling like they had to be safe or to pass as straight or so that kind of purity culture gets in there with like the gold star kind of language, like who's damaged goods and who's pure. So we got a lot of layers of stuff going on here.
Yeah, it's can be overwhelming to the person experiencing it because,
Yeah.
in that moment, they're trying to make sense of it, not only to themselves, but to other people that matter to them.
Yeah, and I think there's not a lot of understanding of um there are higher rates of sexual violence that are experienced by bisexual people. There's higher rates of suicide, mental health issues, sort of health disparities. Of course, there are those disparities for queer folks in general, but when you divide it out, it's like, okay, what's going on for bisexual folks that's even higher? And part of that is that isolation and sort of loss, not finding space in queer community or straight community, and feeling very isolated and like where, I'm not queer enough because I'm still partly perceived as straight, so I don't belong. And then I'm not really straight because I, am having same gender loving interactions or, whatever that experience may be. And so, how does that impact mental health? I mean, that's, one example. Another example is, therapists and doctors, mental health folks are human, right? And they're influenced by all of this also. So they're going to have their own bias as practitioners. How does that isolate bisexual people if they're not taken seriously? That's part of the book too, in the mental health chapter. How can practitioners and providers of care be better informed to take folks seriously? And if you're feeling like your identity isn't legitimate, that decreases people accessing, healthcare and feeling like I'm going to be judged. I don't want to go talk to someone that I like, had sex with one gender identity yesterday, but then the week before I was with another. So like,
But
how am I going to be treated? Am I going to be truthful? All of this adds to those disparities, and um, all of these stereotypes and sort of the hypersexualization, particularly for women, how does that increase vulnerability to violence? Like, this idea of like, oh, if you're bisexual, you must be kinky, you must be, a freak in the sheets and, this super hypersexual person. Um, all of that bias increases vulnerability to both violence and health disparities. And again, that's a conversation that's typically not happening, and people aren't getting the training to actually support bisexual people.
do you find even in the community that there's a separation too? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I've had folks that like, some folks that I interviewed who, were trying to find a therapist, and the therapist, was queer identifying and provided services for queer folks, but that was some of the worst bias that she had ever experienced, was that therapist. And it's like, again, being told that they were confused and needed to make a decision, kind
oh,
of thing.
what that was
Yeah.
what that was said in the session.
Yeah.
Oh, geez.
And just like, um, here's this person who is listed as queer friendly, and it's like, okay, you're kind of missing the mark here.
What about in the community of, the acronym, that way I'll have to say it again. The acronym, do you find in that community that even they have their biases? That,
Yeah, I mean that's for a lot of the folks that I interviewed, that's been their experience has been, facing that bias. I don't think the queer community is inherently biphobic, but again, they're humans that are influenced by all of this messaging, and their usually bias is based in fear of the unknown. And if you're hearing that, like, you can't trust a bisexual person because they're going to flip on you in the blink of an eye, there's not going to be trust and there's not going to be understanding. And, I think, of course, there's going to be folks who are, more informed than others.
right,
But, a lot of the folks I interviewed talked about really feeling shocked that they weren't accepted in a lot of queer spaces, or felt like they weren't queer enough, that they were somehow a traitor if
mhm,
they did anything sexual that looked like a heterosexual interaction, right? Like that somehow they weren't really queer. Um, and they're struggling with that, and so are other people. So yeah, they definitely have faced biphobia and bi erasure in queer spaces. But again, I'm not trying to say all are, there's definitely going to be folks that are going to be more informed. But I think that can happen. Certain queer spaces can struggle with perpetuating, ableism and perpetuating racism, and not, as with all movements, there's that you might be fighting one form of oppression, but perpetuating another knowingly or unknowingly.
right.
Um, so I think, that's another chapter is talking about the intersection of bisexuality and disabilities, and how is ableism intersecting with biphobia and bi erasure also. So I'm not trying to be disparaging of any people. I think that people are, like I said, we're products of our society, and how do I shine a light on it to at least create space to have conversations and be like, why did I just crack that joke about, oh, they need to make a decision, they're confused, and
Right.
how easily we make those jokes,
Mhm,
right?
yeah.
Or somebody being like, oh, you're bisexual, you want to join me for a threesome, which is like one of the most common things that bi women hear.
Uh,
And it's like, oh, really? Seriously? Did you just say that?
Based on everything you've shared, I would say this is definitely a must read. I mean, not just for the professional field that we're in, but for lay people, because this topic is cumbersome, to put it politely, but it is also easy to understand, especially, after they read your book. I would think that they would have a better hold on it and actually probably feel welcome that finally somebody is acknowledging, what we're going through.
Yeah, I really try to make it, for educators and clinicians and practitioners, but also the everyday person, to make it accessible. And for bisexual people to be like, you know, oh
Mhm.
wait, this is me on the pages, and I really relate to this because there's a lot there. I included the interviews in each chapter, and there's some personal narratives that folks wrote, and so there's like 35 voices of different people and activists and, just everyday people. So that the personal narrative, is part of it in addition to the research, to make it more, accessible for all of us.
Well, thank you for being a guest today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you.